Hey everyone, this is People Building Businesses, the podcast from the team at YBF Ventures. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Jason Lim, and our guest today is AiCULUS CEO and co-founder Omaru Maruatona. Before we talk to Omaru, I'd like to tell you a bit about YBF. We run tech innovation hubs in Melbourne and Sydney. We help startups to scale, scale-ups to succeed, and corporates to innovate. You can find out more at ybfventures.com. Omaru is an old friend of YBF Ventures. He's been around for ages and spent time here back in 2018 as part of the CyRise accelerator program. We've been following him really closely ever since. AiCULUS is a cyber AI company that helps organizations to manage the security and monitoring of APIs. APIs are widely used to provision digital products and services and to allow disparate systems to work together. But while innovation in this area has grown significantly, the actual process of ensuring the security and integrity of APIs is significantly lagging. And this is where AiCULUS steps in. They're tackling this head on, and they've created tools to manage this risk. Omaru has deep knowledge in cybersecurity and machine learning, so I'm keen to learn more about that and about Omaru, the person himself. He's also, I understand, completed a PhD, so I should really be calling him Dr. Maruatona. So, Omaru, Doctor, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. That's cool. That was a cool introduction. I appreciate it. Yes, I'm formerly Dr. Omaru, but Omaru works. Omaru is a pretty unique identifier, so I'm cool with just Omaru.
That's awesome. So, Omaru, you're a bit of an enigma around YBF. We've known you for a long time. We've been following your progress, but we don't actually know much about your background. So, we understand that you grew up in Botswana in Southern Africa. Could you maybe just bring us back, dial the clock back to your early days? I'd love to learn more about where you grew up.
Yeah, I grew up. I was born in Botswana in a city. So in Botswana, there's two cities. It's a small country just at the top of South Africa, mostly desert, and therefore for a long time there was nothing in Botswana. It was one of the the last countries to get independence back in 1966. So and then diamonds were discovered in Botswana. And over time, it turns out Botswana was the largest producer of diamonds globally. So I grew up, in the backdrop of that diamond mining as it was taking off. So I went to school in Botswana, and then when I finished high school, the diamond mining company has this program where they sponsor the top students, in high school. So I was lucky enough to get one of those scholarships, and I was sent to Australia to study software engineering. So this was back in 2005. I came to Australia, studied software engineering at La Trobe, and then the deal with those scholarships are such that when you finish your studies, you have to go back and work for that company. So I returned to Botswana. I worked for the diamond mine as a graduate systems engineer. And this was in the world's largest diamond mine. So the world's largest diamond mining operation. It was cool. It was really cool. My job was to program the machines that process diamond mining. So if you think of a diamond mine where large haulage trucks get the sand and the rocks, and then that sand and rocks get separated and crushed, all of that, all the way until a diamond is extracted at the end of the process. So my job, there's a lot of machinery that, loads the raw rocks and mud, because it gets mixed with water. The first process is crushing. So from mixing with water, acidification, and X-ray separation of diamond and rock. My job was to program those machines, and it was a really cool job. I loved it. I did that for a bit, and then I returned back to Australia in 2010 to do an industry PhD. So an industry PhD is a PhD where an industry partner, in this case, for me, it was a bank. One of the big banks in Australia had given money to a research center. And so they give the funds to a research center, and then they specify the problem that they want the research to tackle. So the project I was assigned when I did my industry PhD was to investigate the feasibility of machine learning and AI into internet banking fraud detection. So in 2010, internet banking was still relatively new, and the way fraud was being tackled at the time was through the use of mainly rule-based systems. Now, rule-based systems, the biggest disadvantage with them is they, maintenance intensive. So every single time something changes, you're going to have to get in there and modify a rule, right? So if you think about how many customers a bank has and their unique, way of, interacting with the system, and, there's going to be multiple rule modifications for particular individuals, for particular use cases. So it's tedious. And so machine learning at the time seemed to be, a viable alternative to rule bases. So my job essentially was to develop, machine learning approaches that we could compare to what the bank had, and see whether there was an edge there in terms of, performance, in terms of accuracy. So again, very interesting project. I loved it. Did that over 3 years. And at the end of the 3 years, that's how I got my PhD. Shortly after that, I joined a financial services company, Computershare. They do share registry, all the back end in terms of buying shares, selling shares, trading shares. I was a security analyst there for 2.5 years. It was. My job was to look after the company's networks, from a security perspective. Again, very interesting job. Learned a lot. It was very hands-on. It's where I like to say I got my hands dirty from a cyber security perspective. And then after that, I joined PricewaterhouseCoopers. I joined PwC, studying off as a senior consultant, doing security audits, penetration testing, security assessments, anything to do with cybersecurity. I did that. By the time I finished at PwC, I'd worked with big mining companies. I'd worked with big banks in Australia. I'd worked for the state police. I loved that job because there were so many things I got to do. I got to learn a lot. I had done some of PwC thought leadership, publications to inform our customers and the market about what was happening, what we thought was coming, But also doing that work gave me a lot of insight into, the technology world, what was happening in technology, what was coming in terms of cybersecurity and those things. And that's pretty much how the inspiration for AiCULUS came about. I'll stop there because I kind of given you a mouthful, so I'll let you chip in, Jason.
That's awesome. Thank you. That's a really great comprehensive background. So I appreciate that. Just before we jump into some of the nitty gritty, what inspired you to get into machine learning and cybersecurity? Was there a particular inspiration that you drew on to dedicate your life's work towards that?
Yeah, look, when I finished my first degree and returned to Africa, this was I finished my degree in 2008 and started my job in 2009. So at the time there was the GFC, right, the global financial crisis, and therefore there was a lot of uncertainty because particularly when there's a financial crisis, nobody buys diamonds. So our business was in trouble, and therefore, I could tell that it would be wise to have some kind of plan B. So I started looking around and I saw this opportunity to come to Australia with the bank and the research center. So I took that. At the time, I did not know a thing about cybersecurity. I did not know a thing about machine learning. It was it was a conceptual idea at the time. It was more abstract than real. But something about it kind of intrigued me because I thought, if this really could work such that you train a machine to be almost as smart as a human being in a specific task, I'd love to be able to do that. So, I took a leap of faith. I came into machine learning, novice, no prior background whatsoever. But the more I immersed myself in it, the more I loved the prospect of it. So, back in 2010, it was still very much like, what's machine learning, what's AI. But if you look at it now, it's everywhere. It's impervious. It's almost agnostic to anything we do technologically. And I'm happy to have come into the domain at the time when there was not much about it known, and to get in and go as deep as getting a PhD, it's really helped me to understand what's happening.
And jumping to your PhD, you mentioned that what you were doing was basically developing a machine learning system to replace rules-based security or fraud detection in banks. Were they receptive to something like that as you were developing it? And did you find success in replacing those rule-based systems with machine learning?
Yeah, absolutely. Because the thing is, the bank wanted very good, analysis and assessment of, if this thing works, how better is it than rule bases? What are some of the roadblocks we could potentially face as an organization if we were to implement this, right? So I helped with all of that. And the bank was receptive to it. The bank saw value into that sort of approach. And I don't want to take the credit, but I'm pretty sure that that piece of work is what informed them to then go on and ramp up their efforts in that direction. So very well received, and it's something I'm quite proud about.
That's awesome. Thank you. And as you moved on to places like, PwC, where you've had exposure to all these different companies, how did you develop yourself into becoming a thought leader in the field? Was it tough to stay ahead of trends, for example?
Yeah, look, I find that because again with consulting, I had never consulted. My previous experiences have been diamond mining in a very technical role, and then coming into a PhD where I was mostly liaising with the bank contacts, the fraud and security team, and the researchers at a university. And then at Computershare, my role was not client facing; it was security. So to go from that into a role where I was constantly having to talk to our customers, our clients, whether it's debriefing on a job or presenting a report, I had to learn, and I had to learn fast. So I immersed myself. I love learning. I love new things. There were challenges, obviously. There were things I got wrong, but the learning part is what excited me. And before you know it, I was starting to get the hang of it. I really, really love that gig. Yeah.
Did you see specific commonalities in mistakes companies were making when it comes to cybersecurity, and the management of data? Were there common weaknesses across these different companies?
Yeah, look, typically with cyber, when I was a consultant, and I guess it's the same now, is there's the human element, right? You can have the best systems in the world, but those systems are designed to be used by a human being. And if the human being does not use them in accordance with how they're meant to be used, then you've got a loophole right there. So that was a big one. And then the other one is just hygiene. The way technology moves so fast is such that every time a loophole gets found, a security weakness gets found, the manufacturers provide a patch, which is meant to sort of, prevent that loophole from being exploited. But those patches, they come almost monthly for the big systems. Microsoft certainly has this monthly patch releases. But you find that not every organization either has the capacity or takes those patches seriously to patch monthly and to keep up with them, which is how in so many cases attackers then go after that loophole. So I would say those two at the time were the major thing. And then the other thing as well is complexity. I worked with organizations that had the budget to buy every technological security tool they could. But the more you stack these things up, the more it just gets too complex, such that every time there's a team change. Remember, this is cybersecurity, so your specialist may find a better job elsewhere tomorrow. And when they leave, there's a gap there because they're the ones that understood how things operated and worked. So when they leave, there's a gap. And that gap, before you find somebody that can understand how it works and the complexities that are involved, that becomes essentially a vulnerability. So that was another, thing that I found to be quite persistent across, the different organizations I consulted with.
And did the idea for AiCULUS or AiCULUS, sorry, come to you while you were at PwC itself? It seems that you founded AiCULUS around 2017. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Look, it had always been, a philosophy of mine to when I start a new job, I'd always ask myself, what am I learning and to what end, right? So every time I do a job, every time I get a new job, I've always told myself that I'm doing this job so I can learn this, so I can do that, right? So whether it was the PhD, whatever it was, PhD, computer share, and PwC, there was always a thought at the back of my mind that, with this knowledge, I have to be able to do something at some point, such that when I started at PwC, there had to be a trigger to say, well, now is the time. So the idea certainly came when I worked at PwC, because things were starting to crystallize in terms of, APIs are here to stay. Open banking is being introduced in the UK. And at the time, Australia was considering, going along the same path. And many countries have some kind of variation of open banking, which is essentially open digital platforms. And those things use APIs, right? So if you look at that as an avenue for a business, and the value proposition is, yes, this is happening, but what I'm contributing to this whole ecosystem is the ability for organizations to do this securely. So I started crystallizing the thought, doing a bit of research in my own, spare time. And then when the time was right, I took that plunge. For me, the opportunity was the CyRise, accelerator, because that was 50K. That was 6 months of, just learning how to start up a business, learning how to scale it, and access into VCs, right, into venture capital firms. And obviously, you guys provided a good environment for that to happen. So I appreciate that as well.
Thanks, appreciate that. So for the people who aren't too familiar, I think I gave a small elevator pitch at the start, but could you give us your version of the elevator pitch for AiCULUS?
You caught me off guard, because I never thought I'd have to pitch. But look, AiCULUS essentially, and I don't want to sound techie here, but essentially what we do is we allow organizations to embrace API technology without increasing their risk profile. Simple as that. How we do that is we use behavior analytics powered by machine learning to ensure that your API traffic as an organization is thoroughly screened and you're notified if there's a threat.
Awesome. I think that's a lot more concise than the one I gave at the start. So appreciate that. So you founded the company in 2017 with a co-founder, Solo Kambani. How did you two know each other?
Look, I founded the company. I always go to lengths to explain the difference. So I founded the company. Solo had been a friend. Solo and I used to travel on the V line, right? Because he lived in Gordon, I lived in Ballarat. So, which is, a bit of a journey to get into, a bit of a commute to get into Melbourne. So we met on the train, and every morning we would, just have a chat, sit together. So I told him when I started AiCULUS, he was still employed elsewhere. And then I said to him, I think it was 5 months in, I said, look, I think it's looking very likely that I might stick with this, with AiCULUS. And I said, if you ever, found the will, the opportunity to also try this, I'd be keen to have you on board. So 10 months later, Solo came on board, and he was our COO. Still is, by the way. Yeah.
That's awesome. Could you go a bit into the early days of AiCULUS? You mentioned that CyRise was the catalyst for you to actually really take this heads on. What was the experience like in those early days?
Look, I think what a lot of people don't know is, the way CyRise works is you pitch an idea. The idea gets assessed, and there's a panel that decides. There's industry experts that we do a bit of a speed dating, and then they choose who they thought was the best team and the best idea, like in order. So my idea was shut down immediately, and I won't even tell you what it was. So I didn't get into CyRise because I had an idea. I got into CyRise because Scott, in his wisdom and vision, right, thought, your idea sucks, but I'll link you up with somebody who has a better idea. So I came into CyRise as a co-founder with somebody else. And then we got to spend time in Israel, just iterating on different things. But, I highly regard Scott, but at some point I started to think the pairing was not working. I was not feeling it. I was not 100% with it. So I asked Scott if I could be excused from that partnership. And again, in his wisdom, credit to him, he said, "Yeah, look, I'm happy for you guys to split, but what are you gonna do?" And that's when the hard work started. Because when he gave me the opportunity to, try something else, do the research, make sure it's a solid idea, that's when I really went into, APIs. Let's do a bit of research on them. So that's kind of how I got into CyRise. I didn't, I created somebody else for helping get me into CyRise. And while I was in is when I kind of took off on my own. So that's kind of the story. That's what not many people know. So, but yeah, Scott, was I still till today really respect the wisdom he had, because he believed me when I told him that, look, this is not working. Just let me try something on my own, and I'll make sure it'll work out. And he gave me that liberty to do that, and we're here today because he believed in my ability to pull it off.
That's awesome. And compared to the company that you initially joined CyRise with, how did you know that AiCULUS would be successful? How did you know that AiCULUS was the thing that you wanted to continue with?
I think in the early days of founding a company, it helps if there's one decision maker. This is what I just feel. We were in a 50-50 arrangement where every decision has to be vetted or voted down by the other party. So essentially, if you disagree on a lot of things, everything is a compromise, which means that, on average, you're getting 50% of your vision in, and the other 50% you don't necessarily agree with. And I just didn't see that working for us. So, you ask how I knew that AiCULUS would work, because I thought if I have the ability to start something, experiment with, my own thoughts. I consult a lot, and I'm not saying that I take decisions unilaterally. I consult a lot, I analyze, and then I execute. So I just thought that my decision model was better than the one we had, where we had that partnership. And I thought that the vision that I had always imagined, if I go into business, was a bit grander, a bit more daring, a bit more ambitious than what we had in the previous arrangement. So that's why I knew that I couldn't stay.
And what were the early days of AiCULUS like? What's involved in actually creating a company like AiCULUS?
Look, man, it was tough. It was hard slog, as you can imagine, because the early days is you call something that's not there, and you talk about it as if it's there. You say, AiCULUS is a global company. We're building this, or we already have this, and you get people behind the scenes saying, you're not global. It's one person, and you're just in Melbourne. So what do you mean global? So, but I would do it the exact same way. I would go out and say global. I would go out and say, this is the problem we're solving for organizations. So the early days were hard from that perspective, because it's an idea you're talking about, and you're talking about it as if it's there. I mean, people knew that that's what you're building. It's not like just saying it's here, you can use it today, right? But framing it that way helps your potential customer, your potential collaborators also crystallize that thought, also perceive it the way you are sort of conceiving it, because for me to know that this thing had legs, I had to talk to CISOs, I had to talk to security executives, CIOs, and say, this is what we're building, and this is how it's going to solve your problem in your companies. And every once in a while, you'd meet somebody who gets it and say, "Oh yeah, I can see how that could help," or somebody would say, let's talk when that thing you're talking about is actually here and I can interact with it, right? So the early days were lots of ups and downs. You'd meet somebody who'd be good encouragement for you to keep going, and then another day you meet somebody who say, "You left a job at PwC." What were you thinking? So, but again, it's that will to just plow on and just trust in your instincts that you understand what you've lost, but you're counting on where you're headed. So yeah, early days where there were lots of those very down and deep days, and quite exciting days, just thinking about the prospect of a company.
That's awesome. Thanks for that insight into that. So if you don't mind, could you maybe go a bit deeper into API threats and API security? What's the actual risk around using APIs, calling APIs?
Look, the risk is APIs are going to do what technology has not done before, which is with an API, you are allowing a request to come into your data, interact with your data, or even enact a service from your company, right? They're innovative. They do a lot, but this is not something we've done before, particularly if you look at the way APIs operate. For example, with fintech, if I may use that example, typically the way that banks would interact with their customers, where it was always direct, it was always you paying something with your card or withdrawing the money. With fintech, we're asking the banks to say this third party that's gonna deduct money from my account, but I've given them the blessing to do so. I've authorized them to do so. So you all of a sudden have a third party introduced between that equation, which was typically between you and your bank, right? The bank and their customer. There's that third party now, and the complexity there is quite enormous. So that's just one of the examples where it's just gonna be APIs running around doing things for a whole lot of people under the assumption that they've been authorized, right? And that's why our value proposition is, yes, it's good to have that authorization, that authentication, but it's also important to have an additional layer where we're saying, yes, these are authorized, these are authenticated, but can we also make sure that they were not authorized under false pretext? Like if I, for some one way or the other, if I get your credentials, right? The authorization authentication mechanism are going to look at the creds, username, password, all of those, and say, yeah, this check out. Therefore, let's let it through, right? But you and I know that it could be somebody else trying to do that transaction on your behalf and without your blessing. So that's all we're saying is, it's good to have those authentication authorization controls, but it's also super important now to do a bit more screening and inspection of these APIs. And what makes it relevant now is we're seeing an increasing, almost exploding use cases of APIs all over the place. A mesh in some cases, right? There's going to be a whole host of APIs doing this for that party, and then it requesting other APIs to do a bit more as part of one service. It's not going to be one API authorized by yourself. In some cases, it's a chain of APIs, chain of authorizers, which is just too complex. And therefore, I think our value add is quite strong and very, very relevant, particularly now with open banking, open digital channels, right? So the threats that, you were inquiring about, one that comes to mind is credential theft. That's a very serious one. There's another one, account takeover, right? That's another very very serious one. And why we know this is serious is, there's a company called Verizon, and Verizon every year they release a report that talks about data breaches and the causes of those data breaches. And for the past 5-6 years, if you look at those reports from now till maybe 2015, you'll see that, authentication bypass attacks are on the rise. You'll see that credential theft is another big issue. Account takeovers, and in the context of APIs, those attacks are very, very relevant to open APIs. So, hence why we're here and why we're saying, we can help.
And we've seen Australia face growing cyber threats over the past few months. I mean, even Scott Morrison came out the other day saying that Australia was under constant cyber threat. What's your take on that and the risk that the country is now facing?
Look, it's not surprising that at some point technology was going to replace, in this case, human spies, right? Technology is cost effective. Technology, I guess, to an extent, is quicker, a bit more effective than human spies, right? And if it goes bad, nobody dies, nobody gets detained. So I don't think it's surprising that we're seeing the increasing use of the use of technology to do espionage, which is what we call cyber espionage. So, I think it's timely that the Prime Minister came out and said, this is a serious threat, and consequently we will be increasing investment in the area. It's something obviously that as a cybersecurity business I welcome, but not just for for the good of my business, but I think national security, for the good of the country, for the good of other businesses in Australia, right? Because if all of that were to continue unaddressed, the effects are quite dire.
And on the note of investment, they've mentioned that the Australian government would invest about 1.35 billion into cybersecurity over the next 10 years. That promises to create about 500 jobs. Do you think that's enough to combat the growing threat of cybersecurity and cyber espionage?
Look, I think whether it's enough or not is kind of a secondary point, right? In my opinion, at least, I think doing something, that's what matters. And we're seeing the government do something here, which is, it's welcome, It's not something that you could just sit and hope and wish away, It's something that you need to address head on. And I think what the government has addressed, it's a good step. I definitely welcome that.
Awesome. So jumping back to the topic of AiCULUS, in 2019, you joined the Austrade landing pad, which brought you to Singapore. What was the process like, and how did it work out for you?
Yeah, look, that's where I'll bring Solo into the mix, because I credit him because he fronted that landing pad program. Solo was in a position where he could move to Singapore for 3 months. The landing pad is 3 months. So Solo completed that, and his job in Singapore was to really look at whether we were relevant. API's security is relevant. AiCULUS is relevant in Singapore. And Solo came back and said, I think there's something in Singapore. And then what I did is I then also joined the I-71 program, which is another 3-month accelerator. Again, in startups, doing 2 accelerators is often frowned at. It's like, what's next? Another accelerator, another 50K, and you just hang in there, right? So, but I knew the criticism against doing multiple accelerators. I knew, sort of the bad vibe attached to that. But, when you're doing business, sometimes you got to think for you, right? For your business. And so I did it despite, some opposition. So after Solo came back, I then went back for 3 months. I was in Singapore. And that's where I think things really started to look up for us. And so, yeah, being in Singapore 6 months altogether, if you look at Solo's 3 months and my 3 months, that really helped us.
And what was it like for you being in Singapore itself? What was the startup scene there like? And I guess, was Singapore the right fit for your company?
Yeah, look, I think the appetite for what we're doing is justified in Singapore. Everywhere you go, everybody's embracing new technology, and often that new technology involves APIs, because of the innovative part of, API capability, because of the way they allow that seamless customer experience. There's a thing called omni-channel, which is with APIs. It doesn't matter whether you're accessing a service from your laptop, from your mobile, whatever, right? APIs make it seamless, and that customer experience is quite, it's smooth throughout. And therefore, I think off the back of that, Singapore saw a need and a value for our product. So it was good to be there. And I have to also, mention Austrade for this, because they organized that landing pad that Solo did. So quite grateful for that. We still partner with Austrade quite a lot. And that's the thing, the unasked question, which is the partners, your CyRises, your YBFs, your Austrades, they're super helpful, and there's no way you could do what we did without those partnerships.
That's fantastic. And you've also actually raised capital from a Singaporean-based investor, is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, we just closed, I think it's 950K Australian dollars from a Singapore VC, Cocoon. And yeah, that's off the back of the work we did in Singapore, which is great. For me, all that funding signaled was, it was a market indication that what we're doing is relevant, that somebody else thought that what we're doing could potentially be profitable, had legs to grow and scale. So if I look at that, the fact that we raised the money, and to me that's all it means. It means the market sees that there's value here.
Did you celebrate after closing the investment?
It took too long. There were a couple of false celebrations. There was a point we thought, it was all done, and I said to my wife, I need to get a drink so we can celebrate. And then we got the drink, and it kind of didn't go through, and I said, we'll drink it anyway. So we drank the drink. And then I think there was another second time. This time it was Solo. Solo was saying, no, I think it's happening this time. So I went off, bought champagne, and didn't happen. But when the champagne is chilled, you can't let champagne just chill forever. So we popped it again. And then the third time it happened, I'm like, you know what, I celebrated before. So it's all good. So yeah, I celebrated a few times, but before the fact, unfortunately.
So COVID-19, new world, obviously. What's the impact of COVID-19 been on your business, and how are you navigating it?
Yeah, look, it's been massive. Those two false celebrations I was telling you about, COVID is to blame for that, because we thought the investment would go through faster than it actually happened. I mean, everybody tells you that it always takes a while, and I got that, but COVID just made it took too long for the investors to do the due diligence, to get everything in line, to finally say, you know what, everything is signed, we're in, right? So that's the first sort of impact that it's had. But also, given that we are a small company, right? Both age-wise and size-wise, we get a lot done via face-to-face interactions. So the first thing COVID killed was, that physical interaction. And so I find it harder to really put together a case and convince particularly larger corporates via a video interaction. I mean, it's super useful. We're leaning onto it now, but, it does not compare with that face-to-face interaction. So COVID has, it's been a bit of a, it's slowed and dampened things down for us in that perspective, but also travel, right? There's a few things going for us in Singapore. Again, COVID meant we can't be in Singapore in and out as we can. So yeah, it's affected us multiple ways.
And I guess you're finally now an international company because you do have that Singapore and Australian footprint. And I'm guessing with the travel restrictions, it's just extremely hard to navigate being an international company, taking money from overseas investors, etc. So
yeah, it's there's definitely that. But the good thing is we now have we've just onboarded a CTO, Chief Technology Officer in Singapore. So So there is, and we also have an engineer in Singapore as well. So we're still kicking goals. It's just that we would have hoped for this to happen under different circumstances.
With the amount of people working at home because of COVID-19 and obviously relying more on digital tools, and hence, requiring a need for more APIs, do you think this presents an opportunity for your business?
Yeah, absolutely does. You said it precisely there that you know working from home, but also transacting a lot from home. I mean, typically, if you were used to going into a takeaway shop and buying your takeaway and taking it home, right now it's all about your the apps that order your food and get the food delivered to your home. Again, that's API. So you know we've never been more relevant than now. And as much as we don't want to be alarmist or to try to be being hype man, I think the time calls for people to really, organizations to really look at their APIs, how they're using them, and just having a conversation to say, is this sustainable long term, or do we really look into boosting this APIs to make sure that the returns are commensurate with potential risks.
And what does the future hold for AiCULUS, both in the short term and in the long term?
Look, short term, we just gotta get over this COVID crisis. And then long term, I see growth. I see us truly being global. The thing I said in the YBF video 2 years ago, when it was sketchy, it's getting more and more real now, and I love that. The ability to look back and say, I said this when it was a bit debatable. Now it's kind of becoming real. I love that. I see AiCULUS really growing. I think the context now, the environmental, even COVID, right? COVID's played into what we do. It's not something we wish for. I mean, it's taking lives, and it's bad, whichever way you look at it. But what is also highlighting is we really need to look at the way we use technology to provide services, right? And really look at how secure it is. And AiCULUS is smack in the middle of that. We help with that.
Fantastic. And Omaru, I just have one more question for you before we wrap up the podcast, because I'm conscious of time. You've been really generous with sharing your story, some of the challenges, some of the risks you've personally taken to start this company. In your time embracing the role of being a startup CEO and a startup founder, what are some of your top learnings that you'd like to share to some of the listeners on this podcast?
Yeah, look, the number one is the partnerships that I spoke about. Every single thing we get, I could do an analysis for you if I had time, but every small win and even a major win that we've had is because there's been a silent partner on our side, either introducing us to a big collaborator, introducing us to a customer, or helping us have space to work at, right? Collaborations are absolutely important. Those partnerships are super critical. That's number one. Number two is feedback, right? As a CEO, most of the time, I've never been CEO myself before, right? So a lot of things are new, a lot of things I have not done before. So being able to take in feedback from a range of audiences, it's also important, from your team, from advisors, from everyone that you meet, because people always have opinions, and it's always important to really listen in. Some of them, yes, you end up not using, but do constantly listening. They call it keeping your ear to the ground. I find that very useful. What else? And then finally, ecosystems, right? We have different ecosystems, whether it's the ecosystem of CyRise, former cohorts, the ecosystem of YBF, tenants, all of those things. You find collaborators there. You find companies and people who can help you get to that next level. So that's important for me, because the bottom line is you don't know everything. You don't know everyone. You're going to need somebody to teach you a thing or two, to introduce you to somebody else. So I'm all about collaborations. I'm all about partnerships.
Omaru, thank you so much for your time on the podcast. If someone would like to be a customer or to invest or to learn more, did they just head onto your website?
Yes, please. Email me, Omaru at AiCULUS.co. And yeah, we're currently hot, and I'd be keen to talk to potential investors, potential customers, because I think the problem we're solving is real, and I think we could be really good value for businesses out there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Omaru. It was great to chat with you on the podcast.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I appreciate it.